Hello, everyone. Today I'm with Safron Rossi, Ph.D., and Safron has spent her life steeped in literature, religion, and mythology, fields in which she holds her degrees. She's core faculty at in the Jungian and Archetypal Studies program at Pacifica Graduate Institute. For many years, she was the curator at the Archives, which hold the Joseph Campbell and James Hillman collections. And she has edited a book, a volume on Joseph Campbell in the collected works, which is on the goddess, and it's entitled The Goddess, Mysteries of the Feminine Divine. So welcome to you, Safron.
Thanks so much, John, for having me on your show.
Safron, a little later, I'd like to get on to Joseph Campbell and Helman, who are two different figures in one way, quite different styles, haven't they? But they're both very steeped in mythology, and I personally have taken a lot from both of them. Yeah. And hopefully a little later we could talk about the Odyssey as well. But I wondered whether we could just start with a little bit of your story and how you got to, you know, some of your, a little about your family and how you got to Pacifica Graduate Institute and all of that.
Okay. So how I stumbled upon, right. So I grew up in New York City back in the late 70s and 80s, when New York was really a melting pot, a cultural melting pot for, people coming from all different countries. And my mother immigrated from then Czechoslovakia, and my father grew up there, but he was half Italian, half Dominican. So one of those really interesting kind of old school New York meetings. So, and given the time frame, this was a period where there was so much interest in religion and spiritual experience and just this expansion of consciousness. And my mother was very interested in all of those things. And I was basically raised in a kind of spiritual seeking household, which included, being a part of the Theosophical Society and going to the Hare Krishna temple, and, just in a really multi-religion, multicultural world. And so this, myth and the psyche and art, all of this was just a part of my formative childhood years. And I just had a passion for myths, particularly early on Arthurian legends. And that was really what led me, what I ended up studying in college, quite in a focused way. And that eventually led me to Joseph Campbell and his work. And the first work of his that I read in entirety was The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And, anyone who has read that book, Jung is Campbell is in his own way a Jungian. Not in a full-on classical way, but in terms of, Campbell's feeling, belief, sensibility about the importance of myth in terms of our lived human experience, that it, as it did in old times, ancient times, as it does today, it describes the fundamental principles that the psyche needs a connection to in order to feel aligned, to be in a state of health, to be related to the individual spirit, to be related to our kind of cultural zeitgeist and the greater, even spiritual questions. I mean, and that sensibility, I think, is very much what, supported by Jung's own, ideas. So anyway, maybe I sort of said all too much all at once, but from Campbell, it was for me, it was Campbell to Jung. Yeah.
I think I was just reading in your book, actually, Safron, about, the period from the Iliad to the Odyssey, and Campbell's talking about that period. And what strikes me about him is just, he reminds me of a sage. He's just got so much knowledge on one level, but he's got a very nice way of getting it across. But he just knows so much about myth and so comprehensive, but he's the person that's kind of popularized for more than anyone.
That's right. I think in the Goddesses book, I think one of the reasons why that it feels so easy is that the material for this book was actually based on talks he was giving. So back in the 70s, Campbell would do these multi-day long retreats, like at Esalen near Big Sur in California, or at La Casa de Maria, which was the name of the spiritual retreat center that Pacifica is now located in Santa Barbara. And so the material in the book was actually Campbell speaking. So I think it has that kind of flow and ease, right? Because and I edited it so that it just could be read more easily. But that also points to that these ideas in particular were some of the sort of blossoms of Campbell's decades study. I mean, 40 years, study of myth, teaching myth to college undergrads at Sarah Lawrence. I mean, he
steeped in it.
Absolutely, and he just had a prodigious mind. I mean, he read not just English but French and German fluently. So when you're in his library, which is housed on the smaller campus at Pacifica, I mean, he's reading Arthurian legends in French and German. Like, he read von Eschenbach in German, and his margin notes are in the appropriate language. I mean, he just was just a brilliant mind. So his ease in being able to recount the stories and the historical dimensions of myth and religion, but then the relationship to Jung would be his recognition that these myths are speaking about archetypal principles and archetypal patterns, and that those remain even after the ancient Greeks are gone, or what I mean, that and those stories still speak to us today because they're touching on those archetypal values, and we can recognize them and relate to them and locate them in our life, so long as we have a metaphorical ear, that we can hear myth metaphorically rather than literally. Yeah.
And the dream, the dream is the little myth every night.
That's right.
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 That was his thing.
Right. Dreams are our private myths, and myths are our cultural dreams. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, I wonder, and in a little while, Safron, maybe we could get back to Pacifica and all that, but I'd also like to get onto this topic of the hero's myth, because there might be some people that say it's kind of a bit of a bloke's thing, the hero myth, or a bit outdated now, or whatever. I personally think he's talking about the mythological journey, and as your book shows, you said a lot about the feminine and the divine feminine and all of that. But it's a topic, isn't it? It's like the
Yes.
hero myth.
Right.
What should we think about it now? And maybe we could just touch on that a little bit. But let's
Yeah.
go back to your story and how you
Okay.
got to Pacifica, and then maybe we can
Oh,
get on.
okay. Yeah, okay, sure. So when I was finishing college, and as I mentioned, um, my my studies focused on Arthurian legends. I loved school, and I knew I wanted to continue, that I wanted to go to graduate school. And the internet was the World Wide Web. I mean, this was 1999, 2000. So, the web was around, and we were able to start to discover things that, we would have to have gotten mail to know about, physical mail. And in my research, I was looking for graduate programs in the study of myth, and there really weren't very many. There were some specialized programs. I remember Harvard had a Celtic studies, master's, PhD specialization. I mean, really focused things. But in the course of my research, I found Pacifica, and Pacifica had a mythological studies program. And of course, that's where Joseph Campbell's library and archives was. And like many people that I've met over the 20 years that I've been a student and now a faculty member at Pacifica, we have this experience where we just know that that's the right place for us, that those ideas, the idea of the collective unconscious and the archetypal basis of the psyche, and in terms of the myth program, the looking at myth from that perspective rather than just a more maybe religious studies perspective or a historical perspective. And I just knew that even though then, being very young, 20, 21, I didn't really understand anything about the psyche or the archetypal basis of the psyche. I just knew on a very intuitive level that that was true for me, like that was getting to something about my own short lifelong obsession, with legends and myths and fairy tales. And so to Pacifica I went. Yeah.
And is that when you started at the Opus? Did you start?
No, I didn't start working at the archives until I was working on my dissertation. So that was a handful of years later. So I started working there once I began, writing my doctoral thesis. Yeah.
And so let's take up this, Safron. James Hillman, Joseph Campbell, very different people in one way.
Right.
Like I see Joseph Campbell as a little courtly myself, like out of an Arthurian legend sometimes. He's quite a gentleman, in his own way and all that. Whereas James Hillman, bit renegade-y, bit tricksterish, can turn you upside down if you're not careful. But they're both, I mean, what is it? What do you like about it? And where are they connected and where are they a little different?
Right. Well, for me, they're connected. I had the incredible good fortune of working with James Helman. His archives, some of it had already arrived by the time, like his manuscript collection, but he was coming to Pacifica once a year. He was teaching in the classroom, and because I was involved in the archives at that point, I got to work with him. And then I was even on a number of occasions went and stayed with him and his wife at their home in Connecticut to work on his manuscript collection to ship back to the archives. So he was very much, I mean, both um, a mentor in the sense of the enormity of his ideas, and they were ideas that I had studied in my graduate work, and but also a living person that I was relating to. And so in that way, he was very much like a grandfather figure for me, and someone who I felt very dedicated to, and the legacy of his work, and wanting it to be taken care of, and to do right by it in whatever way that was. So that, combined with, equally so, my attachment to Joseph Campbell, not as a living person, because I never met him as a real breathing person, but being immersed in his work in my studies, being immersed in his work down in the archives. And so for me, Campbell and Helman, it was a very personal attachment in different ways. And I think in one way that I might put it is that Campbell was like my grandfather. Like, in my imagination, he was like the grandfather that kind of spoke from the heart. So there's something very kind of spiritual about him. And I think you're sort of seeing him as a sort of Arthurian character speaks to that. Like he's concerned with inspiration in life, and he's concerned with these kind of ideals, and the way that we can relate to them and find our North Star ideal, and be in attendance to that. And so there's something very inspired about Campbell's sensibility. And to me, that really kind of moved me in a heart sense. And with Helman,
and especially because you were so
yes,
young, maybe when you
right,
when you started reading and Campbell.
yes, and I think that the whole notion of the hero's journey, which you touched on, is very much about trying to link our life and our aspirations to a sense of the greater spirit that's trying to live through us. And there's something inspired about that whole notion that our life is not just ours, that it's maybe dedicated to something, it's in service to something bigger than us. So that is deeply moving. And with Helman, I felt like my mind woke up, or was like set on fire. I mean, I think Helman is truly a genius, one of the most brilliant thinkers, one of the most original thinkers coming after Jung. And there's just something about his way of the metaphors, and his way of sort of being something of like a warrior for the soul, a warrior for the psyche, and that and the sharpness and the wit and the profound intellectual capacity, it just makes my brain turn on in a million different directions. And so I just felt awakened by Hillman's work, and then having that more relational sort of dimension. They both of them just shaped me and shaped my sense of what the importance of myth and the psyche, so that's how they came to me. They came to me in these very direct, personal kind of ways, but then also all of the scholarship and the intellectual dimension. So, so they're not necessarily figures that we would put side by side, but in my path, they came side by side in my path. And they are both lovers of myth, of course. Yes.
And I was watching a podcast the other day, which you were speaking in, Safron, and you said something about Helman and Aphrodite, and I found that surprising at first, like being
Yes.
influenced by Aphrodite. But I think
Oh,
there's
yeah.
something really good about that, because whilst he's got that bit of Mars, if you ask me, and he
Yeah.
can be quite strong, and there's a lot of fire and all of that,
Yes.
it's kind of in the service of beauty. And maybe that's a point, maybe that's not something that people always get about Helman, that it, you know, the amount of time he's pointing towards the beautiful, you know, the beauty of the psyche, the beauty of life.
I think you're totally right. I think that he was very martial, and his way of his rhetorical style, I think, can put people off, or the way that he doesn't go in for kind of clear conceptual structures, which should be a more Jungian sort of sensibility, can feel very sort of Uranian to people. Like they feel really disrupted or disoriented by his refusal to kind of hold to one perspective. And I also know, I mean, this wasn't my experience, but I know that in his earlier decades, I mean, he was a bit of a martial figure, just in the way he kind of would, you know, could speak with people, or he, you know, he didn't suffer fools gladly. But I think you're totally right, that if people can kind of, you know, put the saber down and kind of let that sit for a moment, we can, you know, what is Helman doing? He's trying to have us pay attention to the beauty of the psyche in its polytheistic, multivalent, suffering plurality. And he wants us to learn to listen to it and to love it. I mean, and that's how he talks about, you know, Persephone as being the one who comes to love Hades, our coming to love the psyche with all of its, you know, strange, pathologized, you know, difficult dimensions. But it is really about beauty. I think it comes down to beauty. And you know, when we look at myth, and that's not just in Greek myth, but in many of the different mythic entanglements, love and war are always lovers. They're always joined, because that which we love, that which is most beautiful and delicate, and has to be protected. It has to be defended at times. It needs the safety to flourish. And so there needs to be that martial warrior that knows how to make sure that the love and the beauty has its space and its and yeah, to be to unfold. So,
and just one last thing on that, Safron, that Hillman had a little bit of a go at the hero a couple of times, I can remember. And so how do you relate that with Joseph Campbell? You know, and getting back to also that maybe there are a few people that don't like the idea of the hero's journey so much. So how do you
right? So I mean, I think those are different. They're sort of slightly different things going on with each of those pieces. So let's just talk about, you know, I think Hillman's go at the hero, as you put it, is specifically about his go at any kind of one-sided thinking. So if we talk about, which Campbell did do, where he talked about the hero's journey as the monomyth. I mean, Helman, of course, is going to set his lance and his charging horse against that, because it's like saying, well, there's one story, and everything about Helman's approach to the psyche is about the many stories. I mean, it's the polytheistic psyche. So
Yeah.
I think Hillman's umbrage, with the hero's journey is the way in which it has often been reduced to being the story. So
Yeah.
I think that's the problem. He doesn't have a problem with the hero per se. The hero is among the whole pantheon of archetypal figures that are a part of the psyche. But it has a tendency to maybe take over, or perhaps in Western culture, there's a great tendency for it to be overblown and take too much space. So
Yeah.
I would put it down to that.
Yeah.
Now, this other piece about the hero's journey that you brought up, which is that people, they look at it and say, well, it's always about male heroes and all of that. I think the really important thing that, and I'll just say it really simply, is that the heroes are not, they don't refer to men. They don't refer to human bodies. The heroes in myth, they're metaphors. They're metaphors for that part of the psyche that that is an active principle that moves toward becoming, and that and if we can connect that to our ego consciousness as having a kind of masculine dimension to it, and by again, that is not equating it to male persons, simply an active driving yang. I mean, we can look in the Taoist sense that it's the yang principle that is moving toward life and moving into life and forward, and that's what heroes in the hero's journey personify. So I think that's the way to understand it, so that we don't get caught in reducing, in a kind of reductive view on the hero's journey, and say, well, it's only relevant for some people and not for others. I mean, as Campbell understood it, and I think it's a really profound point that he makes at the beginning of his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, is that the hero is the one who surrenders to the greater self. That's what the hero's journey is about. And so if we understand that psychologically, it's related to the way that the small ego surrenders to the larger self. And these are using more traditionally Jungian terms, right? Ego and self, and the relationship between those two. So the hero's journey we would see in that sense as synonymous with individuation. The way we go from thinking, my conscious orientation and my desires and my sense of who I am and my willful aims and plans in the world, that's all there is. And if we're involved in the psychological journey called individuation, at some point we become aware that there's another deeper self that has its own sense of what's important, what the direction our life is headed in, and how do we relate to that? How do we come into some sort of deep relationship with that fuller sense of who we are? And that's what the hero's journey describes, in terms of the descent into the underworld and the successful return from that. I mean, and yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, sometimes it's like people take it a little too literally as well, don't they? It becomes a Disney formula for movies, and it's like, these are the 4 parts of the hero,
That's right.
and to me, what you're saying is, like, when you start to call it individuation, and then, in the psyche, it's like sometimes in the psyche, sometimes a male can be like Persephone, abducted into the underworld. Like, it's not
Yes,
totally kind of gender, like we've got many, we
that's
we
right.
can have that kind of experience of irony.
Absolutely,
Mm.
absolutely. And we have female heroes, but their stories move along that heroic archetypal journey in the same way, even though they're a feminine figure. And I'm using masculine and feminine just to keep us at the symbolic level. We're not
Yeah.
talking about men and women, and I
Mm.
think that's important. But one of the things that often, people I often hear too from people about the hero's journey is like they can get a little upset about this whole idea of slaying the dragon. And
Yeah.
I think that what people don't, I
As
think,
Robert
pay
Bly
enough.
says, people say, "Oh, we can't do that." Like, that's
Right,
not a
as if
good
it's
thing to do.
wrong. Exactly. That's right. And what people are forgetting, or they're not paying attention, or I don't know how else to put it, but what they're not really fully taking into account is that there are dimensions of the psyche that are regressive, that don't want change. These are our complexes, our sort of behaviors and attitudes that are sort of shaped by these old complexes that keep us responding and thinking in the same way. That's the dragon. The dragon, in myths and fairy tales, the dragon sits on the treasure and doesn't want anyone to get the treasure back, or it
Mm.
sits on the sacred well and it won't let the water flow, or it's devoured a whole village and is choking the life out of the sacred tree. The dragon is a figure that is actually killing life, meaning it's not allowing nature and life to unfold in its organic way. Those would be our, so
Yeah.
as I was saying, those would be our complexes, our emotional patterns that were important, served us in some way at earlier chapters in our life, but at some point we've actually outgrown them. But
Yeah.
but the the psychological shift hasn't yet taken hold. So the
Mm.
slaying of the dragon is the work of being able to, move out of old identifications.
Yeah.
People in their 30s and 40s still thinking of themselves on some inner level as being children,
Mm.
needing to answer the rules of mother and father. There's something going on there that hasn't shifted, that needs to.
Yeah.
That's the process of slaying the dragon.
Yeah.
Old fears. So I think that yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's
And Saffron, I wonder whether you could just speak a little to the Odyssey, and
yeah,
because it seems to me that in the Iliad, which starred Brad Pitt as Achilles or something, it is war, isn't it? There's the
yeah,
war feeling. And then,
right,
but the Odyssey, there are so many feminine figures on the journey.
right,
It's on the
right.
sea, and they're
Yes,
Nausica, Calypso. So, and it's like
yeah,
it's one of the chapters in your book. So, could you speak a little bit about that? It's a beautiful story, the
yeah.
Odyssey.
Yeah, and that really is my favorite chapter in the Campbell book, because I think Campbell's creativity is so evident in that way. This really unique perspective, and his whole idea is that the Iliad is basically this epic poem that is that is articulating, let's say, the warrior heroic sort of archetypal worldview. And then we get the Odyssey, which to him is the partner to it, but it has everything to do about the feminine principle. right? So he really kind of turns this, the whole way of thinking about the Odyssey, and you know that he himself was inspired by a British writer who actually emigrated to Australia named Samuel Butler. And Butler wrote a work titled The Authoress of the Odyssey, and that was published over 100 years ago, the very end of the 19th century. And he argued that the Odyssey must have been written by a woman, and you know, no one took him seriously. But we don't have to think of even that literally. I think we can just, even in a more metaphorical sense, recognize that there's something about the Odyssey that is so feminine in its focus. So for Campbell, he looks at Odysseus's long, painful journey to get home as being actually about the journey of the masculine coming back into right relationship with the feminine after being so thrown off balance as the Iliad depicts. So it's like Campbell's doing this almost like cultural analysis, saying the Odyssey is telling the story of the way, you know, ancient Greek culture has just emerged out of this like warrior obsessed epoch, and how do we get to another movement forward. So it's a story of repair. I mean, that's Campbell's notion, and the repair. So the let's say the wound is given to us in the kind of opening salvo, like the Trojan War. How did the Trojan War even begin? It begins with Paris, who is this fair youth who is given the frightening task of choosing which three of goddesses is the most fair: Aphrodite, Hera, or Athena. And in exchange for giving one of these goddesses the golden apple, he will be given, you know, a great blessing by her. He chooses Aphrodite, who promises him the most beautiful woman in the world, who is Helen. Now we can read just that myth. So in a more sort of, from this more cultural, historical perspective, we can read that myth as showing us the shift from the Neolithic civilization, where the goddess and the feminine was one of the highest principles, to Bronze and Iron Age civilizations. That the whole notion that a masculine hero gets to choose which goddess is most beautiful is already showing us that something has gone awry. That the feminine has somehow become, is now participating in a beauty contest. Like there's something, we're moving into the territory maybe even of the feminine as object rather than as subject. I mean, you know, you can kind of push into this a little bit, which of course then leads to this horrendous war, which is, you know, a sort of paradigmatic expression of the warrior archetype, and where Helen, woman, is an object of possession and is the very thing that's being, you know, kind of fought for, you know, who owns her, and, you know, and all of that. So we can look at it at that level. But, you know, so following the Iliad and its chronicle of these long, horrific years of battle and blood, so Campbell turns to the Odyssey as a kind of reemergence. And he looks at how those three goddesses that Paris chooses between, which in and of itself is a kind of insult in a way to the divine feminine, that they are the goddesses standing behind the three nymphs that Odysseus meets and who help him ultimately return home to Penelope. So Calypso, with whom the Odyssey opens, that he's on her island and he's been with her for 7 years. She's like the human avatar of Hera, the goddess of partnership. And Circe, who is the sorceress, the demigoddess sorceress, who initiates him into the underworld, is an avatar for Aphrodite. And then Nausicaa, who is the young woman to whom he tells his tale, and she, you know, sort of hero worships him. And he's with Nausicaa and her parents, telling the story of his trials. She's like the human avatar of Athena. And so Campbell, so in that sense, Campbell is saying this whole world that Paris was a part of, this whole choosing of goddesses, this Helen becoming this object of war and possession, all the problems inherent in that sort of attitude, the ascendancy of the warrior, the ascendancy of the masculine, is being eroded by the way Odysseus has to learn to relate to these goddesses, but through these nymphs that he meets.
It's like he's being initiated.
Yeah, exactly.
Through the
That's
family.
right. He's
through
right,
those different aspects.
That's right. And wouldn't we understand that a warrior who has been away from home for 20 years, wouldn't they need some kind of initiation to be able to return home? I mean, not to open up a whole nother chapter, but, you know, I've talked with a lot of students who have come to our program at Pacifica who were retired military, not just men. We've had some female, military service people as well. But any of them that have spent time in active duty have shared the, well, to be honest, like traumatic process of coming back home and the lack of any proper psychological and emotional reintegration from being in combat overseas to being home again. And I think that very real problem that our veterans all around the world face is an archetypal problem which Odysseus gives expression to.